Hi guys, welcome to our first content lecture on the civil rights movements. Let's go ahead and get into it. All right, so the first thing I want you to think about is actually what does home mean to you? In the last unit, we did a little bit of talking about suburbia and what is suburbia. And so that gives us a new way of thinking about what is home. But I want you to take a second to think about what that means for you. Is it a person? Is it a place? Is it where you physically live? Is it the people that you're with? The reason I want you to think about that is because we're going to talk about kind of the consequences of housing policies or the way that we look at homes, but it's also a good way to think about what it means to you in relationship to what it means to other people. Because particularly as we're spending a lot of time at home, some of us are feeling really grateful for how safe and loving our homes are, and some of us are recognizing that it doesn't provide that. And what does it mean if you're in a safe, comfortable home right now versus if you are in a place that doesn't feel like that to you, and how much added stress and things like that is on your life in this already very stressful moment. Okay. And then we're going to look at some pictures of some people's houses. So I want you to just think about, is this somewhere you would want to live? This is a different view. And another. So think about if you want to walk on this hill, if this is how you want to get to and from school every day. Another picture. This is another part of that same area. And you can see on this bridge, move myself a little bit, it says Viva Little Town. And so normally if we were together, we'd have a conversation. But Viva Little Town, meaning long live or live Little Town. And so even though as you were looking at these pictures, this might not be somewhere you want to live, we know kind of from this tag that the person who wrote this does like their community, does like where they live. All right. Somebody who lives in this area that's called Chavez Ravine. It says it wasn't Brentwood or Beverly Hills, wealthy areas, but we were happy people here in this neighborhood. And there's some definitions. So slums. It's almost always used by outsiders rather than inhabitants. Some of the communities so labeled as slums, the term connotated and often confused both poverty and deviance. So when we're talking about slums, we're usually talking about somewhere that we think of as somewhere that is both poor and full of people who are misbehaving, us as outsiders. None of you live there. If you remember back to the first term, we talked about a similar word with ghetto. And you guys know that I won't want to use the word ghetto because it's connecting that poverty with that deviance. So this is a similar thing, a updated word for that. But it's important to think about that this is outsiders that are describing that. But if you talk to people who live in what we might call slums, we see that many of them actually like their apartment. And so I want you to think about why. Why would somebody like their apartment or where they live if us as outsiders say, that's not a good place? To really think about like our emotional attachment to these places and how that changes how we view somewhere. All right, but this particular area that we're talking about, Chavez Ravine, I know some of you might be confused. We're building to something. We'll get there, right? The residents of Chavez Ravine, they get this letter in the mail. It says, to the families of the Chavez Ravine areas. It says, this letter is to inform you that a public housing development will be built on this location for families of low income. The attached map shows the property that is going to be used. The house you are living in is included. In a short time, surveyors will be working in your neighborhood. Later, you will be visited by representatives of the housing authority who will ask you to allow them to inspect your home in order to estimate its value. And then it says make sure they have identification, and then it will be several months at least before your property is purchased. So this letter is coming to your doorstep, and it's saying that they are going to build homes for people of low income on your property. And so therefore, you are going to have to leave. Your house is going to be purchased, or your property is going to be purchased, and you're going to have to leave. So I want you to think about, how are you feeling if this letter shows up at your door? Are you concerned? Are you angry? Are you confused? What's going through your mind? Right. And the thing that is going to allow the government to do that, to buy these houses for the housing authority, is something called eminent domain, which is part of our Fifth Amendment rights. It's not something we talked about first term because it didn't really fit where we were then, but it's important for this, right? And what that Fifth Amendment says is it says, nor shall private property be taken for public use without just compensation, which essentially means that the federal government has a constitutional right to take private property for public use. But it requires the government to pay just compensation or fair market. So the government can come to you and say, I'm going to buy your house. And you can't tell the government no. They have to pay you fair market value, so what your house would get on the regular market if just a regular person bought your house, but you can't tell them no. Okay? The reason that the government has the ability to do this is essentially that it's their job to do what is best for the people or the collective good. So it's the idea that you as a private person or using your property for private use might be worth less than if the public could use it. And that's a little bit strange, but you might think of it as if they need to build a school. The value of that school to the whole community is more than if it was just your family's home. And so they're going to be able to use this part of the Fifth Amendment, eminent domain, to take that from you and to build something else. But it has to be for public use. So you might use this for a school, a road, a park, a library, something like that. Okay? But eminent domain is not supposed to be used for private. It's supposed to be for public use. So you're not supposed to have like a private company that can come say, you have to leave your house. We're buying your house. They can ask, they can't force. The government can force. It's supposed to benefit the public. It's a little bit more complicated. They actually used this to build the King's Stadium a couple years ago. Not that anybody is using the King's Arena right now, I should say. But it's the idea that the tax money that would come in or the added economic growth for the city outweighed the private use of the places that were there before. So Sacramento actually used eminent domain in a kind of sketchy way to remove people from that area in order to build the arena. That was businesses at that moment in time, so slightly different. But you're still using eminent domain. All right, so in the late 1940s, we're going to see that there's going to be something called the National Housing Act, and they're going to try and address declining urban areas. This is part of Truman's promise, essentially, and really FDR's second Bill of Rights, that every American should have a decent home and suitable living environment. LA specifically is going to target this area called Chavez Ravine that we've seen pictures of for public housing. So they're going to say it's an eyesore, it's relatively empty, it's fine, we can use that area. Okay? But 20 years later, we see that housing conditions of minority households did not improve as those of non-Hispanic whites. And I guess something I should have mentioned before is that's mostly who was living in this area was Latin Americans or mostly Mexican immigrants or Mexican American families. This is actually the same area that we talked about first term with the Zoot Suit, right? You remember that. All right, so as I mentioned, eminent domain is used to remove people from Chavez Ravine as they're trying to build that area or that public housing. Those people who participate, or not participate, but those people living there were promised first pick at the new public housing and that they would get help finding housing in the meantime. We know that all but 20 families sell out, but neither of those promises are kept. So what's going on? And what is Chavez Ravine now if those promises weren't kept? Chavez Ravine is actually the Dodger Stadium. And I think that this quote from the owner's son is fascinating. He says, it took a great deal of courage to move the franchise, the Dodgers, to Los Angeles without a place to play, until eventually a stadium could be designed and built. It was an extraordinary move. And I say that because it's an interesting thing to use the word courage to build a baseball stadium when even though you're probably like, Ms. Dietrich, get to the point, what's going on? Why do these people lose their houses? How is there a baseball stadium here? I will explain in just a second, but it's odd to think of that courage was used to remove people from their homes, however it is that they're removed, to build a baseball stadium. I also think this is weird because hopefully by the end of this, you recognize that perhaps the people of Chavez Ravine were not treated as well as you probably would want to be treated. But the Dodgers have an interesting record when it comes to this. I would argue on this, they have a negative record when it comes to race. But one of the reasons or one of the things that we know about the Dodgers is in this era, they are they are the first Major League Baseball player in the 1900s to have an African American baseball player, and that, of course, is Jackie Robinson. So, on one hand, I would say a negative record, but when it comes to Jackie Robinson, obviously a much better record. All right, I'm just going to really kind of skip over this part. This is the people that are involved in what's going on. I will just point out these two guys. This is the guy that was supposed to set up the public housing, and I point him out because he thinks he's doing a good thing. We could argue about whether that's true, but he ultimately gets investigated by HUAC, which we talked about in the last unit. So the House Un-American Activities Committee, and he gets investigated for maybe being connected to communism. But really, all he's doing is trying to do this public housing project. He actually at one point sued the government for all of his files and found out that he was being surveilled for 38 years by the FBI, which is pretty insane. And this guy that I'm covering up, this is the mayor. And I just point him out not because he's really that important in the long term, but because the reason that this project is not going to get done is he's going to come into power and he's going to essentially say, we need to stop un-American spending. And that's his code for communism. He's going to try and connect this project essentially to communism, and he doesn't want to fund it. Again, this is the middle of the Red Scare. All right, so these are some of the families that were affected. You can see their protest signs back here. All right, and these guys right here. This one I want to draw your attention to. It says, can you buy 2 houses and 3 lots for $10,000? And what this little girl's sign is pointing out is that the government is giving them this amount of money and they have to leave. But can they turn around and buy the same amount of stuff in another place? Can they turn around and use that $10,000 to buy 2 houses and 3 lots somewhere else in LA? And she's essentially pointing out that that's not possible. And is that necessarily fair? And so you might think of it, you guys know I live in Oak Park. So if the government came and bought my house, Oak Park is one of the most affordable or cheapest places to live in Sacramento. So they came and bought my house. Could I turn around and buy a house for that exact same money somewhere else in Sacramento? And the answer is no. And do we think that that's fair? And then I mentioned earlier that about all but 20 families sold out. And when those families don't leave, they're going to be forced out. But these pictures are of their places being destroyed. You can see kind of all of the destruction in this one. And then here they are physically being removed from their house. All right, so why doesn't it get built? And I've kind of already hinted at this, but some are going to fear that the housing project was socialist or communist. Again, it's the Red Scare era. Oh no, we can't help people have housing. That's terrible. Then they won't work hard, et cetera, et cetera. And so they're essentially canceled. This public housing contract is canceled in the early 1950s. So the city's going to take that land. They're going to promise they're going to use it for public use. That's part of the deal. But then the Dodgers show up and they're like, hey, this looks like a good area for a Dodger Stadium. So the city of LA will agree to give them that land. Technically, they can say they didn't do anything wrong because they had what is known as a city referendum. So they let the city vote on what would happen, whether it was okay if the Dodgers moved there. And the reason I point this out is because, again, it's supposed to go to public use. A baseball stadium is not public use. You have to have a ticket. You have to pay money to go there. It's not all the public can go to that building or that place. The other thing is you're having the city of LA decide what's going to happen to a small community's home. I ask you whether that seems fair, whether another silly example or a different example might be, should all of Sacramento decide what happens to my house? If I don't want to move, should all of Sacramento be able to decide that I have to go? I ask you whether you think that that's right. But regardless, ultimately Dodger Stadium gets built. These are just some pictures of what happens. All right. And then I'm going to print this out because this is happening at about the same time. So this is known as Operation Wetback, and this is really getting into Eisenhower. And this is essentially the Eisenhower administration doing mass deportation of Latinos. So the first one during the Great Depression. We had the Bracero program during World War II, which is where you bring in Mexican citizens to the United States to work in mostly agriculture to make sure we're producing enough food during World War II. But this is going to try and kick out a bunch of people at this time. It's a military-style operation. That rounds up more than 1 million people. including American citizens. They're not very careful about who it is that they're rounding up. And it's not like they're giving people notice. They're like literally snatching people in the middle of the day on the street, throwing them on a bus or a plane, and then essentially dropping them over the border without resources. And in some of those cases, you're talking like in the middle of the desert, and people die. So it's very quick. And then they're going to be like, come on, backpedal and be like, all right, we're done with this. No more funding. It was a success. We're moving on. And I point this out because you're kind of seeing, I'm going to argue, the racism of the time versus Latinos, particularly Mexican Americans in this area in the 1950s. It's also the true beginning of border control in the United States. We're going to see it grow a lot under Nixon. We know it's very strong right now, but you're kind of seeing the birth of those things. Also, just so we're clear, that's a very derogatory name to give a government program. Do not use that. All right. And I'm going to make some connections today. One of the things that we've seen the president do in essentially the last week, at least from when I'm filming this, is an attempt to stop immigration. What he said and what he'll be able to do are probably going to be different things. But the idea of that we need to protect American jobs or Americans from this disease, from COVID-19, and so we need to stop immigration. So I want us to think about, does that seem logical? If we have the number one amount of cases in the world and deaths right now, do we think that people from outside the United States are really going to pose a threat to us, or do we actually pose more of a threat to them right now? Right? Also think about what kind of jobs that immigrants fill or we are relying on right now. And do you think that there are any connections between those things? Do you think that it could actually be immigrants that are taking jobs right now when we have something like, at this point, when you're watching this, is probably close to 25 million people unemployed? What's really going on in that moment in time? One of the other things that we've heard, or is actually in front of the Supreme Court right now, is talking about DACA. DACA is the Deferred Action of Childhood Arrivals. And that's for people who were brought to the United States. They're undocumented, but they were brought as children. So no fault of their own, no decision of their own, they came to the United States, but they're not citizens. Under the Obama administration, there was an attempt to protect those people. So give them protected status in the United States, as long as they followed some protocol. They make up a good hunk of our medical profession, as well as lots of other professions that we need right now. And so that's one of the things that the Supreme Court is keeping in mind as they decide whether it is constitutional to protect DACA. And what would it mean if we stop giving protection to the thousands and thousands of DACA recipients that are our doctors and our nurses and all those other very essential jobs at this moment? All right. So kind of going from there, we're going to kind of go into Kennedy, and then we'll really get into African American civil rights. All right. So this is Kennedy, but it's going to kind of be a bridge from Eisenhower because of this guy, which I'll get to in just a second. So if you remember Kennedy from our last unit, he comes in, he has his young wife, he's beautiful, his family is beautiful. There's going to be a lot of attempts to kind of change what it means to be the first family, a lot of focus on the arts and things like that. His domestic policy is called the New Frontier. And that's going to be important to kind of keep in the back of your mind because Johnson's going to do something different with it when he gets into office. All right, he's going to make a promise to go to space, again, kind of trying to prove that we're better than the Soviets. But the thing that's really doing a lot while he is in office, and then we'll pick up even more once Eisenhower gets there, is as a result of this guy right here. And this is Earl Warren. And I say he's kind of our bridge between Eisenhower and Kennedy and then LBJ, because he gets appointed to the Supreme Court. He is the Chief Justice that is appointed by Eisenhower. He's a really interesting guy. He had been governor of California, done a bunch of things in California, actually really conservative when he was involved in California politics. He actually is one of the people that helped make Japanese incarceration possible during World War II. So I don't know what happens to Warren between then and when he becomes the Chief Justice, but he is one of the most liberal progressive judges, I would argue, that we've had on the Supreme Court. And his court is going to drastically change quite a few things for Americans. So the Warren Court is absolutely important for us to remember. So I'm going to kind of go over the basis of them. I'm not going to talk about them all individually, so I'm not giving you all the names really, but I want you to kind of make sure that you understand from these massive changes that are happening under the Warren Court. So some of the first major changes are on voting. So we're going to get a couple things. Number one, redistricting is reviewable. And it's kind of a complex thing, but on this map, these are the different districts, congressional districts, so where our representatives are. And the reason that this is important is oftentimes we've done things like gerrymandering, which is essentially trying to formulate these districts in a way that will benefit one group over the other. So make it easier for somebody to get elected or harder for somebody else to get elected or for those people's votes to count. So essentially, just that the Supreme Court is saying you can't do anything funky with the shapes of these districts. The next one is that those districts are going to all need to be about the same population. So you can't have a district of 1 and then a district of 1 million. That's not fair. They should all have, in that case, 500,000. So it's just about kind of protecting our voting power and how much our votes are worth. That somebody can essentially mess with the system. So essentially, with all of that in place, that one man, one vote. So my vote or one woman's vote should be equal to the next woman's vote or the next person's vote. There's nothing funky going on that's going to give somebody's political power more weight or electoral power more weight than somebody else's. Okay, so essentially just trying to make voting more equal. All right, this one is probably things that you have heard about. So I mentioned, I think in the last video, that we have like federal power and then we have like state power. So this is essentially saying that the federal protections for those accused of crimes applies also at the state level. So for example, if you are accused of a federal crime, you have the right to a lawyer. This is saying at the state level, you also have the right to a lawyer. And if you cannot afford one will be appointed to you. Search warrant, federal and state level. They have to have probable cause or search warrant. You have a right to a lawyer during questioning, and you have the right to remain silent. So again, all of these are protecting people who are accused of federal and state crimes. This is also really protecting poor people who are accused, particularly if you talk about that you have the right to a lawyer and a public defender if you can't afford one. So this is saying you cannot railroad somebody who is accused of a crime, particularly if they are poor. You have to give them their fair shot in the legal system, trying to make it better at least. All right, and the last one is kind of review we talked about in the last unit. This is saying, or this is protecting religious freedom, no prayer in school. Okay, no school prayer is a better way of phrasing that. Essentially, the school can't make you be involved in a prayer because it's a violation of your First Amendment rights. All right, so this gets us to the beginning of the African American Civil Rights Movement. So over here I have it as CRM, so Civil Rights Movement, or Freedom Rights Movement. You see a lot of historians refer to it as the Freedom Rights Movement or something like that now because it's broader than just civil rights. It's also thinking about civil liberties and all of those other things that go into play to make us equal, okay, or to try and improve equality in the country. So I will try and use freedom rights just so you know what I'm talking about. All right. This is just a timeline of some of the events. I'm not going to talk about all of these. It's just here to help you if you want it. I will just point out this, kind of a bridge from last term. So just a reminder that in the 1940s, we see the desegregation of the defense industry and then the military. And that comes kind of out of the Double V campaign, if you remember, in World War II. So this is double victory at home and abroad. So in World War II, we're fighting to destroy Jim Crow or segregation in the United States at the same time that we are fighting the Nazis. So trying to do that. And I mentioned that actually in the last unit as well with Vietnam, because again, coming in World War II, you see African Americans serve as a way to try and show that they deserve full access to all that America offers. And we see a different response in Vietnam. All right. But World War II is kind of our catalyst for global liberation. At the same time, though, we have Jim Crow at home. We have it in theaters, in zoos, drinking fountains, laundry, and then it comes home. It's an example of somebody. And it says he was court-martialed for refusing to sit in the back of a segregated army bus. So I point this out. This happened same time as World War II. This is also 10 years before Rosa Parks. And this man, of course, is Jackie Robinson. And Jackie Robinson actually at one point in his life says, I cannot stand and sing the anthem. I cannot salute the flag. Think about where we see that right now. All right, why Jackie Robinson? If we're in class, I would do this whole thing about the trailer for 42. We would do another activity with it. But I want us to think about, why Jackie Robinson? And as amazing as Jackie Robinson is, but there are probably baseball players that are just as good as him, if not better. But one of the things about Jackie Robinson is he was able to not fight back. And what I mean by that is if you were going to be the first African-American baseball player in Major League Baseball in the 1900s, you have to be able to withstand everything that people throw at you, both metaphorically and physically. Like, people threw all sorts of things at him. People or pitchers try to throw the ball at his head, all these sorts of things. And he has to be strong enough not to do anything, not to respond, to kind of take it. Because they know the moment that he kind of gives into that, he shows any sign of rage or anger or violence, because he is having to take all of this. People are going to be like, oh, we can't have Black baseball players. We're not ready. Look at how terrible they are. And so he has to really have the strength to not respond. And I ask you to think about what you do when you get angry. Do you think that you would have been as strong as Jackie Robinson in this situation? All right. And then I just love this. A couple years ago, it would have been Jackie Robinson's 100th birthday. And so they published 100 photos from his life. And he was on the track team at UCLA. And I just love this photo. Hey, guys. Okay. So after Jackie Robinson and kind of after World War II, we're going to start to see the civil rights organizations mobilize, and we're going to kind of see some of the first victories of the civil rights movement. And the very first one is going to be the Supreme Court case. And the reason that we're going to see the Supreme Court case, Brown v. Board, which I'll get to in just a second, is because of the NAACP. In World War II, they're going to see their membership explode. What that means is that they're able to finance a major legal battle over segregation or getting rid of segregation. And this is really important because that's the role the NAACP is going to play, is sort of the organization behind the scenes, or the communication behind the scenes, and the ability to raise a lot of money that can be used to fight these things. And lots of times they're taking the legal battle away. They're not going to be doing the protests or the marches in the middle of the streets. They're going to be trying to fight things in courts. So that's important. That's also important because, again, when we talk about nonviolence as a method or a tactic, what we think about is what MLK is doing. This is also a tactic. It's a legal tactic. It's different. So there's lots of different ways to kind of fight for the same things. But again, this Supreme Court case is Brown v. Board of Education. Okay? It's very famous. You've probably heard of it even before right now. And what it's going to do is it's going to say separate is not equal. This is going to overturn a case called Plessy versus Ferguson that said separate is equal. So what it's supposed to do is it's supposed to desegregate schools, K-12 schools. And even though this is a massive win, it's not an immediate win, and it's going to be a complicated win, because even though the Supreme Court is going to say separate is not equal, you have to desegregate schools, they don't tell the schools how long, where the funding is going to come, what are the logistics. They just say, do it. And particularly for states who don't want to, there's no incentive for them to move fast or to make this a reality. So we're going to set up some battles. Before we get to the battles, I want to point out a couple things. Number one, his name's right here, Thurgood Marshall. He is going to be the lawyer for the NAACP and for these families. And he is going to be super important. He's going to win. And he also then later is going to be appointed to the Supreme Court. He will be the first African-American Supreme Court justice. And I think a pretty cool dude. This is a Hollywood movie that came out about him prior to this case a couple years ago. So you might want to check that out. Why is there a baby on here? And the reason that there's a baby on here is this is one of the baby dolls that was used in something known as the doll test. And this test was an experiment that was done prior to Brown that essentially was showing that separate is not equal, and the negative effect of racism or systematic racism that children experience, children of color experience. And this research was used to prove that separate is not equal and to essentially convince the justices to side a certain way in this case. You guys, for part of your journals, are going to look at a version of this or a compilation of versions. It's not as scientific as the ones that was used for the Supreme Court case. But I want you to really pay attention to the emotion that you see on these children's face as they are looking at these different dolls, a black doll and a white doll. And I really want you to think about that emotion and also maybe your own emotion as you're watching this. And how does that show you that something's wrong, that something is not equal in this situation? And then I want you to kind of think of some of these follow-up questions, and I'll just point out two things. Number one, pay attention to the bias that these kids seem to have against people that look like them or dolls that look like them. And what does it mean if you harbor that bias or that animosity against people that look like you? And how do you think that might manifest itself in society? And then this test is specifically done about race, but I challenge you to also think about it with gender or sexuality, and think about it in terms of like, what kind of TV shows did you watch as a kid? What were the cartoons? Did they look like you? Does it matter if they look like you? Maybe also think about the dolls that you played with when you yourself was a kid. Did they look like you? Did they represent who you were? And the reason I want you to think about that is oftentimes what we show in media or things like that represent the dominant culture, whether that is white culture, whether that's male culture, whether that's straight culture. And what does it mean if you aren't part of one of those dominant groups and you're not seeing yourself, you're not being represented? What does that say? And also, what kind of society are we creating if we only have room for those dominant stories or that dominant culture? And what are the consequences for that? How does that lead into who we are, how we think about ourselves, or what we think is right or wrong or the norm? Okay. So from that Supreme Court case, we're going to see that schools become battlegrounds. And one of those first battles is in this picture. This is one of the most famous pictures in American history. So you have this young woman, Hazel, she's a high school student, and she's yelling at this young woman, Elizabeth, here. Okay? Elizabeth is one of what is known as the Little Rock Nine, a group of 9 African-American high school students that are trying to integrate a high school in Arkansas. They are trying to integrate this school. The school and the state does not want that to happen. Even though the Supreme Court says they have to, they are resisting. The entire state is resisting. And I want you to really think about if you are trying to integrate a school, there's 9 of you, and this is the experience. This is a mob that wishes you harm, and this is what you're walking through every single day. Do you think that you could still be academically successful? Would you have the courage to not fight back, like Jackie Robinson or the Little Rock Nine? If we were reading our textbook, they talk about that these 2 women are friends, that that Elizabeth has forgiven her. I think that's a stretch. I think that they are civil enough that they can talk, they can do speaking engagements now. Hazel says that this was a mistake. She doesn't think like this anymore. I don't know about that. Okay. All right. But what we see is because the school is so resistant to integration, to change, that the National Guard is actually called in to protect these kids for the rest of their school year. And this is a really big deal for a bunch of reasons. Number one, I want you to think about how well you could focus on your academics if this is your daily experience. I point this out for a couple of reasons. A, I think that this is an incredible amount of strength and bravery that these students have. But they're not just random students. They're actually tested to make sure that they are smart enough and that they are strong enough to handle this. Because they know that the moment they give in to the chaos that is there, they fight back, they shove somebody back, or they don't get straight A's, people will be like, look, they don't belong here. They're not capable. And so they have to be better than everybody else. So there are local activists that are making sure that these 9 are strong enough to withstand everything that is literally and figuratively thrown at them. The other reason that this is important is those National Guards are sent there by Eisenhower, who's president at this moment. Eisenhower does not want this to happen. Eisenhower doesn't want anything to do with civil rights. why I mentioned that his record might be mixed on civil rights. Maybe you give him more credit for the Cold War, not so much on civil rights. He doesn't want to call them in. He does. He knows he has to. But the reason that this is an even bigger deal is because Chief Warren, remember, is the guy that's in charge of the Supreme Court at this moment. He's the head honcho. He is going to write the majority for this. He is essentially why the court sides this way, or he's going to voice why the court sides this way. He gets appointed by Eisenhower. He is not the justice that Eisenhower thought he was getting. And so Eisenhower actually says of Chief Warren that it was his biggest mistake in his entire career. It is the thing that Eisenhower regrets the most, which I think is pretty funny. Sometimes when you appoint somebody, they don't turn out to be who you thought they were. I think we as a country lucked out that we got the Warren we got, not Eisenhower's Warren. But it's a thing. All right. But it's not just high school students that are doing this. It's also little kids. So this is Ruby Bridges, or a painting about Ruby Bridges. And she is a kindergartner in New Orleans. Okay? And this painting is called The Problem We All Live With, and it's by Norman Rockwell. We actually talked about last term. He did FDR's Four Freedoms. But he does this painting, and he's really talking about that this is a collective problem. While you see Ruby Bridges in this painting, it's something that we all kind of need to deal with. And I think that this is a really powerful painting for a couple of reasons. Number one, you see Ruby in this painting. She is standing up straight. She is both brave and pure, and she is able to withstand all this. Nothing is hitting her. She is our future in this image as she's trying to integrate their school. The other reason this is a really interesting photo is Ruby Bridges is only, I think, in her 60s. So this wasn't that long ago. In fact, this wasn't so long ago that this painting, while Obama was in office, was hanging in the White House. And there's a photograph of Ruby Bridges and Obama next to this painting. So living history as well. Also, is hyperlinked a podcast about this because as much as we want to talk about these things being victories, and they are, it is incredible that they were able to integrate these schools and the bravery, again, of these young people. We actually see that our schools have gotten even more segregated for complicated reasons. So if you're interested in what that looks like today, it's hyperlinked. All right. Just a little side note, if you've heard anything about crisis actors with any of the school shootings that have happened in the last couple of years, one of the things that we've heard is that, oh, they're not real, they're crisis actors, it's fake, blah, blah, blah. Those aren't new conspiracy theories. They actually go back a really long time, whether we're talking about Reconstruction or even in this newspaper article. This is talking about that these kids at Little Rock 9, that they are crisis actors, that they're it's not real, it's all staged. And it's not. It's absolutely not. These kids bravely face these really, really terrible circumstances. Right. But unfortunately, our long arc of history is not always forward progression. Sometimes we move backwards. And I'm going to give you a full warning about these pictures. Right. This is Emmett Till. So about a year after Brown, which we would like to think was a step forward, via the death of Emmett Till. Emmett Till was a 14-year-old kid from Chicago. He goes to visit his family in Mississippi for the summer. He begs and pleads with his mom to go visit his family in Mississippi. On, I think, his very first day with his family in Mississippi, he and his cousins go to a store. And the version that everybody had heard was that while he was there, he flirted with the white store clerk that was there. He whistled at her or something like that. And then in that evening, that woman's husband and brother showed up at Emmett Till's family's house and removed him from their house. This is not a time where you could say no, that harm would come to the entire Till family if Emmett Till was not removed. And so Emmett Till was removed from the family, and these two grown men beat up this boy and ultimately force him to carry a big metal fan, tie it around him, shoot and kill him, and throw him in the river. By the time they find his body, he is so disfigured that the only way to identify him is a ring that he has on a finger, a singlet. And so, but because his body is so disfigured, they're going to claim that they can't hold these two men accountable, even though it's very clear that these are the two men that did it. It's before you have DNA testing and things like that. So they essentially get away with the murder. Emmett Till's mom is going to hold an open casket in Chicago, which is where this picture came from. It's a very disturbing, it's a very gruesome photo, but she insists on doing that because she wants America to see what they did to her son. That this is what racism looks like in the United States, that this is what they do to boys. It will also become important when we talk about the Black Panthers, sort of the connection between this young man and another young man that we'll talk about. Also, this book that's on here, The Blood of Emmett Till, was written by a Duke historian in the last couple of years, and it got a lot of press. And the reason it got a lot of press is Tyson, interviewed the woman. And what we found out when he interviewed the woman is that she made the whole story up. Emmett Till didn't flirt with her, didn't whistle at her, none of that. And so if we think about that's the spark that ended Emmett Till's life, how horrific that is. Not that Emmett Till should have ever have lost his life, but that it amounted to that this white woman had the ability to put those things into motion. Obviously, that's a system that exists in Mississippi that had been festering and happening for decades, for hundreds of years, really. But just the atrocity, or even more of an atrocity, that she lied, and it had consequences of that nature. Right. This is her funeral. Mammy Till is his mom, and his mom is a pretty incredible, and I would argue powerful, strong woman. She will actually use some of the money that is raised from this, and this experience, and losing her son to help fund the bus boycotts, which is where we're going next. The bus boycotts also very much influence Rosa Parks, and kind of is another factor that helps propel Rosa Parks to do what we know that Rosa Parks does. All right, so we have Brown, we have the unfortunate Emmett Till death, and then we get one more victory in the bus boycott, and then we're going to pause for a little bit when it comes to victories. So one of our first victories of the trench victories, which will make more sense when you look at your journals, but this is the trenches in that it's the people that are doing this. All right, and Julian Bond, who was a civil rights activist, he explains it this way: it's the dominant narrative. Rosa sat down, Martin stood up, and then the white folks saw the light and saved the day. So he's really talking about that we simplify this, or we boil this down to something that is actually not based in very much fact, but it is easy to digest and it makes us feel better. We're going to complicate that. So I'm not going to read this whole cartoon. You can read it if you would like. But this is essentially kind of expressing part of that dominant narrative. But in this version, it comes out super quickly after the bus boycotts. It essentially describes Rosa Parks as this old, tired woman. And Martin Luther King comes in and saves the day. It's a lot more complicated than that. Also, it's like talking about like Martin Luther King and some of these early activists of like running copies. And at this moment, it's like a very slow process. You can kind of see this tool that they have here. And as wonderful as Martin Luther King is, there's no way he's running copies like that. It was a team of women that were making this happen behind the scenes. All right. So we see Rosa Parks. And so we know that she refused to move or to give up her seat on a segregated bus in the South, in Alabama. She'd actually been a volunteer with the NAACP when this happens. However, she's not the first. We've actually talked about a couple of people who have done this before. Whether we talk about Ida B. Wells, we talk about Jackie Robinson, but even in Montgomery, she's not the first. One of the first people to refuse to give up their seats is a woman or a young person named Claudette Colvin. Claudette Colvin is a high school student, and she refuses and is arrested twice, I believe, for refusing to give up her seat. But they don't choose her as the face of the movement. And the reason they don't choose her as the face of this challenge is she's pregnant. She's a high school student and she's pregnant. And this is a time of what we call respectability politics. So you want the ideal person. You don't want anybody to be able to poke holes in who they are. And so if you have Rosa Parks, it's supposed to be this like nice, respectable, mild-mannered person. It's easier to get everybody behind her than it might be to get somebody behind a pregnant teenager. There are lots of issues with that, like saying that Rosa Parks deserves something more than this teenager when it comes to civil rights or civil liberties, but it's the way that they're focusing or the way that they're operating at this moment. The other thing I'll point out is Rosa Parks was Claudette Colvin's mentor. So one of the things that is also going through Rosa Parks' mind is this is her mentee that is having these experiences. And so Rosa Parks is thinking about how do I stop these things? So this is her arrest thing, or her, I think it's actually her guilty thing. And it says that she's found guilty and she can pay $10 or she can do 14 days of hard labor. And again, she's being found guilty of not giving up her seat. So she can pay $10 or 14 days of hard labor. This is a picture of her getting fingerprinted. Both of these photos that I've shown you of her are actually staged, which doesn't take away from their power, but it was a way for them to try and get their message out or this image out. So they have photographers come back and take these photos later. All right, but what starts as a single action by Rosa Parks, inspired by lots of things, is going to turn into a protest for over a year. So for over a year, the Black residents of Montgomery, most of who are women, the majority of them are women, are going to protest this bus company or a boycott of this bus company. All right, how and why are they successful in this boycott? So this is a letter from a woman named Joanne Robinson. And she wrote it, but it's going out to the community right after Rosa Parks is arrested. And I'm going to kind of summarize what it says. You can take the time to read it if you'd want later. But she essentially is pointing out that another Black woman has been arrested and thrown into jail for refusing to give up her seat. So when she says another, she's touching on that this is something that's repeatedly been happening to Black women. And she talks about Claudette Colvin and that they deserve these rights. And the reason that I think this is really important because you're seeing that this is a pattern. She's going to talk about finances, that it's a lot of women, Black women that are riding the buses. So they are making up the ridership of the buses. And that it is, women affecting women, that they make up a lot of the ridership. Also, it's the economic consideration. Sorry, that's the part I was missing. Is that if Black people are 3/5 of the riders of the buses, if they stop, if there is a boycott, there are going to be economic consequences for the bus company. And so what they see is what they're going to do is a single day boycott. And that boycott will turn into over a year. All right, so things that help. Heard some of that in Joanne Robinson's letter. So pre-existing tensions. They were already upset about things. They'd also already threatened to do a boycott about a year earlier if things didn't change. So the infrastructure to make a protest or something like this happen was already in place. And then you get the spark. So you get Rosa Parks. But even Rosa Parks is more complicated. It wasn't like she woke up one day, or let me rephrase that. It wasn't like she was just tired one day and she was like, meh, I'm not moving today. She knew exactly what she was doing. She had just gone to something called the Highlander School, which is like an activist school to kind of learn the skills to be an activist. And she came back with even more sort of pride and dignity and less willing to put up with the things that were happening on the buses. And to just kind of show you how far she was willing to go, there was a particular bus driver that she did not like, that she knew did not treat particularly women well, whether he was assaulting or harassing them. She refused to ride his bus, except the day that she gets arrested. She rides his bus again, and she knows, or she's making a conscious choice to make a statement with what she's doing. Again, behind the scenes, we see a lot of women organizers. They are going to put the carpools together because you're going to have carpools that are operating for over a year, the bake sales to fund it, kind of the telephone tree to kind of organize all this information, get all of the papers out, all that sort of stuff. It is women behind the scenes that are making that happen. The bus boycotts does give us the creation of SCLC. so the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, which MLK will be the leader of. But this is an interesting thing. MLK just moved to Montgomery. He was new to the community. And so the people actually choose MLK to be the leader of this because they know he's not local. If it goes bad, they can be like, well, he wasn't one of us and he can just go. So they're willing to kind of sacrifice MLK if things don't work out the way they want. Fortunately and great, they work out, but they don't have the confidence or they don't know the king that we know at that moment. So they're taking a risk or they're hedging their bets on that. All right. So some other things that make this possible. We see mass numbers. You see the majority of people in Montgomery that are participating. So you're talking about thousands and thousands of people that are working together collectively in unity to have a boycott for over a year. And so that shows a lot of determination and unity to do this, to agree to not ride the buses, to organize a carpool, to walk. Some people walk between 7 and 14 miles a day to get to work or wherever they needed to. Some of you can't even do your attendance on the day. Can you imagine if you had to walk 14 miles to school? So this is pretty incredible. There were some allies that were helpful. We'll talk more about allies in other instances. And then you have to have faith and you have to have courage. Courage because the white community is not going to be happy about this activism. And there are going to be some threats and some consequences for people who are involved. And then faith. You have to have faith, not MLK will talk about religious faith, but I would talk about faith in a more broad way because you have to have faith that things will change, that things can get better. You're not going to walk 14 miles a day if you think you're going to fail. So you have to have that faith that things will get better. And one of the reasons that I pointed out kind of the white community's resistance to what's happening is some of the people that are involved in the carpool or that are like taxing people, they actually get charged with a conspiracy to destroy the bus company because they're helping people not ride the buses. So if they're not riding the buses, they're not buying tickets for the bus, and that's going to financially hurt the bus company. And the reason I point this out is we're in the Cold War, we're in the Red Scare, and here you have these people that are making decisions about what they do with their own money and their own lives. So that American capitalism and freedom that we're always talking about, but the moment that they exercise that, their freedom to do with what they want or to do what they want with their own money, they're like, whoa, you can't do that. You can't make your own decisions. You must buy bus tickets or whatever it is. So this weird hypocrisy that we see. Okay? Last two things. Media. You need the media attention on this. You need people to pay attention to what is happening in Montgomery. And so people across the country are reading what's happening in Montgomery. That's important because you get more attention on it. You get people paying attention. It's also going to show to other communities that they too can push for change. And the last thing, all of this activism is really important, but at the end of the day, it's going to be the Supreme Court who steps in and says, no, absolutely. Just like we said with the schools, separate is not equal. You cannot segregate the buses like this. You cannot continue to keep them separated. These are just some interesting photos from the Highlander School, the training school I mentioned. And I point that out because sometimes it gets labeled as a communist training school. It's an activist school. It's actually still around, although their building burned in the last couple of years. This is a picture of MLK there, and there's a parks right there. But this is a billboard that was in the South. I can't remember what state it's in. And it says Martin Luther King at Communist Training School. And I point this out because while it seems probably pretty ridiculous to us in 2020, you see this massive effort to try and discredit civil rights activists or anybody who is trying to change the status quo or to, I would argue, improve things in society, that they try and label them, mainstream America will try and label them as communists or bad people or too radical in order to discredit what it is that they're doing. So you will hear MLK referred to as a communist or too radical, blah, 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 as a way to try and discredit him. The leader of the FBI, J. Edgar Hoover, is famous for this. All right. Just an interesting story. I don't know, maybe you want to do it for an extra journal entry if you'd like, about all the cooking that was involved in the Montgomery bus boycott, how you made that happen in order to raise money for the efforts. So a big sale. Right. But even Rosa Parks is more complicated than what I just told you for a couple of reasons. On one side, you have is a picture of her house. When the boycott was over, Rosa Parks actually gets run out of Montgomery. She can't find a job. So even though we think about her as a civil rights hero, her life was really, really hard after that. So she ends up going to Detroit and will live in Detroit for the rest of her life. When she died, nobody wanted her house, and so it was not protected or saved as sort of a monument. And so this man actually acquires it, and it got moved to Germany, of all places. But he's in the process of trying to bring it back to the United States, and hopefully we will treasure it more than we did the first time around. But the other reason it's more complicated is this book. And I point that out because this is pretty new history. And it looks at Rosa Parks and it looks at the civil rights movement under a different lens. And what this author says, Daniel McGuire, is that if we look at the roots of the civil rights movement, it actually goes to sexual violence that Black women were experiencing all over the place. If you are in a country, a part of the country where particularly Black women are not seen as, or with respect, particularly white men think that they have the right to their bodies. And so you see tremendous amounts of harm come to Black women in all sorts of really, really graphic ways. And so one of the things that we see is some of the early things that we do in the civil rights movement is to try and protect Black women that kind of got lost in history. So, for example, Rosa Parks' job for the NAACP, her first job, was to investigate rape. And so she is investigating these terrible crimes, and they know that they can't get justice in a court of law. You don't convict people of these crimes at this moment when you're an all-white jury. But there are other ways to get justice. You keep a record so that people know what happened. Or, for example, if that white man owned a grocery store, you no longer shop in his grocery store. So you cause him economic harm, even if you cannot hold him accountable for his crimes, his heinous crimes, in a court of law. The other things I mentioned that Rosa Parks rode the bus of a bus driver that she'd refused to ride. She'd refused to ride because the assault and the harassment is sexual. One of the things that the bus drivers were doing things like harassing women or exposing themselves to women and all these things. And so even though we talk about that it's about, sitting in a bus and not being segregated in the bus, it's about protecting Black women. And so we sell ourselves this narrative about that it's about seats on a bus. It's not. It's about human dignity and protecting their physical being and their well-being in those circumstances. And these women are smart. They know that perhaps a different story will be told. Perhaps they are not going to get justice in the ways that they would like, but they're going to find it in other ways. And they're going to do the organized behind the scenes to make things happen. And yes, we let the men get a lot of credit for it, but behind the scenes, it will be nothing without these hardworking women who are taking the brunt of a lot of these really terrible things. I will just tell you that this book was absolutely life-changing. It's a really hard book to read, but it's incredible. If you ever get a chance, I strongly suggest that you pick this book up. I got a chance to meet this author and thank her for her work. It's also new work. History is not stagnant. Things change. Our understanding of it changes all the time. All right, I'm going to kind of go over this. These are some of the things that I just talked about with you. Wait, I'm going to skip. Actually, you know what? I'm going to stop for the day. I've talked long enough. That's about an hour worth of lecture. I'm good. We'll pick up here. Want to see you guys later.